The canyon walls blurred past her canopy as she forced the crippled jet, lower smoke trailing like a wounded beast. The enemy fighter still tight behind her, every second bringing the lock tone louder, sharper. She knew she could not outrun it, her. Engines coughed, her systems bled warnings across the console. She whispered to herself that survival would come only by outthinking the hunter. She remembered lessons learned in Skies of Fire years ago that the machine was only as strong as the mind guiding it, and she had faced worse with less. Her hands gripped the stick steady even as her arms trembled from the strain. Her eyes darted across the jagged map of stone ahead, searching for a path that was madness itself. A narrow slit in the rock, a funnel so tight no pilot would dare enter it. She banked sharply, pulling the jet toward it, alarms screaming as the airframe groaned. Her breath hitched as she forced herself into the gap, the walls scraping so close, sparks burst against her. Wingtips, the world tunneled into stone and shadow, her body pressed hard into the seat. The enemy followed, diving fast, convinced he had her trapped. His guns blazed fire cutting across the walls, ricochets lighting the slit like lightning. She felt the sting as rounds tore into her fuselage, each hit a reminder that the next could rip her apart. But still she pressed forward deeper into the impossible passage, her vision tunneling, her focus narrowing to a single desperate plan. She whispered to herself, "Hold, hold, hold!" As the lock tone screamed like death in her ears. Ahead the slit ended in a sudden sharp rise, a vertical wall of stone. She pulled hard, the engines roaring, the jet screaming as gravity clawed her back. Vision darkened around. The edges her chest crushed by force, but she forced the climb wings, scraping sparks, fire trailing. Her jet cleared by inches, clawing skyward through the gap. The enemy followed, but too late, too wide. His wing clipped the stone his jet exploded in, a fireball that shook the canyon with thunder. The blast wave slammed her craft, rattling her bones, but she held on, breathless eyes burning with fire. For a heartbeat, the sky was hers alone, smoke trailing behind her, but no hunters left in the dark. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths, her arms trembling with fatigue. She could hear the captain on the radio shouting that the ground team was moving, extraction point compromised, pinned under fire. She knew her mission was not done, even if her jet bled out, even if her body screamed for rest. She banked toward the coordinates, her vision sharp again because she could not leave them stranded in the valley of death. She flew low engines, coughing smoke filling her cockpit. She opened her canopy, slightly the rush of cold air cutting through the haze. Her eyes watered, but she could see the battlefield ahead, fire streaking through the valley, tracer rounds arcing like rivers of light. The SEAL team was dug in behind wreckage, their position, lit by explosions, enemy forces closing from every side. Her pulse surged. She armed her last payload, every switch heavy with finality. She whispered, one strike, one chance. The jet roared into the valley, her presence announced by the thunder of broken engines. The ground below erupted in cheers and shouts over the comm, their voices raw, desperate. She locked onto the ridgeline where enemy fire poured down, bullets tearing through the wreckage, pinning the SEALs. She released the last of her weapons, missiles streaking forward like burning arrows. The ridgeline vanished in a wall of flame, earth shaking as fire consumed the enemy guns. The ground team seized the moment, breaking from cover, rushing toward the extraction zone. Their path suddenly clear. But her victory was brief because her own jet shuddered again, alarms flashing, critical systems failing. She felt the nose dip, engines sputtering, wings groaning under invisible weight. She pulled hard, fighting to keep the bird alive long enough to clear the team's path. Her voice cracked as she shouted into the radio, telling the captain she was going down. She saw the extraction point ahead. A helicopter descending under fire, its rotors chopping the smoke-filled air. The SEAL team sprinted. Toward it lives in her hands, and her only thought was to buy them the seconds they needed. She pushed the throttle, useless engines coughing smoke filling the cockpit, choking her lungs, Her vision blurred, black spots swimming across her eyes. She whispered to herself, "Hold together just a little longer." She banked the jet sideways, turning it into a wall of steel and flame, shielding the team as they boarded the helicopter. Enemy fire struck her again and again, rounds ripping through her wings. Her hull bursting into fire, her body slammed forward as systems died one by one, but she held on steady, determined that if she fell, it would be between her team and their hunters. Her last sight was the helicopter rising blades cutting through fire. The SEALs aboard shouting into the comm, telling her to pull up, telling her to save herself, but her jet was no longer a machine of flight. It was a coffin of steel diving into the valley. She pulled every lever, yanked every control, but gravity won, its grip dragging her down toward the riverbed below. Her voice broke into the comm, telling them, "Go now, live." She whispered goodbye to the sky as the ground rushed up faster and faster, and then the night erupted in a flash of fire and smoke. The valley shuddering under the impact. Her comm went silent, the team watching from above as the fireball swallowed the canyon. Their helicopter banked away engines, straining to carry them home, their hearts heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. The captain stared into the flames. His jaw clenched, his eyes cold with fury and grief, because he knew the mission had succeeded, only because she chose to burn with it. But in the silence after the blast, he heard a faint crackle on the comm. The fire still burned across the canyon floor, smoke curling into the night sky as the helicopter lifted higher, carrying the SEAL team away. Their eyes stayed locked on the inferno below, where her jet had vanished in a storm of fire. None spoke the silence. Inside the cabin, heavy with grief. The captain gripped the headset tighter. His jaw clenched as he replayed her last words in his mind, telling them to go, telling them to live. He had heard those words before from men and women who never came back, and he could not bring himself to believe she was gone. Not yet. The comm crackled, faint, almost drowned by static. A whisper of sound that made every head snap up. The captain pressed the receiver close, shouting her name into the void. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a ragged breath came through the line, shallow, broken, but alive. She whispered that she was down, that she was hurt, that the fire was closing in. The cabin erupted with voices, men shouting disbelief, hope colliding. With the reality of the valley still crawling with enemies, the captain ordered silence, his voice sharp. They would not lose her, not after all she had done. On the ground, she lay half buried in twisted metal, her jet torn open around her, flames licking at the wreckage. Her helmet cracked, her visor shattered, smoke burning her lungs with every breath. Her body screamed with pain, but her mind burned brighter than the fire around her. She clawed herself free, dragging through broken glass and steel. Her hands bled, raw. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself forward inch by inch until she collapsed against a jagged rock. Her comm sputtered against her ear. She whispered again, telling them she was alive but fading. Above, the helicopter circled. The captain, demanding a plan, extraction teams scrambled to adjust, but the valley was still alive with hostile fire. The enemy had seen the crash and were closing in like shadows across the flames. The SEALs inside the helicopter shouted to be put down to fight their way to her. But the captain knew the risk. The helicopter hovered under fire rounds, ripping the air, the crew shouting for orders. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then ordered them lower, because some lives were worth the fire. The descent shook the airframe, bullets slicing past rotors, smoke choking the cabin. The SEALs leapt out, hitting the ground, running weapons blazing, as they carved a path through the enemy, closing on the wreckage, the night filled with fire and steel, bodies colliding in brutal silence. She heard the gunfire through her ringing ears, lifting her head just enough to see shadows fighting in the flames. She tried to rise, her legs buckling. She fell hard against the dirt. She clawed forward again, whispering to herself, just one more step. The SEALs reached the wreckage, finding her slumped, half-conscious, her face smeared with soot, her eyes glassy but still burning with refusal to die. They lifted her onto their shoulders, fire raging closer, bullets slamming. "Against the wreck!" Her voice rasped, telling them to leave her, telling them to save themselves. But they ignored her, carrying her weight as if it were nothing. They fought their way back step by step through smoke and flame, each breath a gamble each. Second, a gift. The helicopter touched down under fire, its crew shouting to move faster. The SEALs dragged her aboard, bullets sparking against the hull. One man falling with a cry, but another hauling him in before the ramp slammed shut. The captain knelt beside her, gripping her hand, her pulse weak but alive. She looked at him, eyes half closed, whispering that the mission was done, that the team had lived. He told her to hold on, told her the night was not finished, told her she had not burned, in vain. The helicopter roared skyward, leaving the valley behind, the flames shrinking into darkness below. Inside the cabin, medics worked frantically over her body pressure, on wounds, oxygen mask over her face. Her chest rose shallow but steady her, fingers twitching against the captain's grip. He stared down at her face, lit by the faint glow of cabin lights, and felt the weight of all she had carried for them in silence. Her sacrifice had not ended in F. The canyon walls seemed to close around her like jaws of stone, the fighter jet shaking with every violent maneuver she made, alarms blaring in her helmet as if screaming of doom ahead. She felt the pressure crush her chest as she pulled sharp into a climb, the sound of engines roaring so loud it filled her skull. Yet even over the thunder, she could sense the predators above. Enemy fighters were descending, their radar locks snapping onto her with merciless precision, her instincts screaming for evasive moves. But she knew one mistake would splinter her into the mountains below. She pushed the throttle forward, the force pressing her deep into the seat, vision narrowing at the edges as the world spun into a blur of black rock and flashing light. A missile warning shrieked again, and she rolled the jet hard, releasing flares that burst behind her in blinding showers of fire. The missile curved, followed, then broke off at the last second, exploding against the cliffs and lighting the valley with a violent glare. The shockwave rattled her bones, but she forced her hands, steady breathing, shallow under the crushing G's voices, cracked over the radio, enemy chatter sharp and cold, followed by the steady tone of her captain, his words, cutting through the storm. He told her to hold the line, to stay low, that reinforcements were still minutes away, but minutes in the air could feel like a lifetime. She muttered acknowledgement, keeping her eyes locked on the radar dots, circling closer, like wolves. She could almost feel them hunting her, every instinct, telling her she was prey, yet she reminded herself she was not prey. She was the blade that would cut through if only she could survive. The first fighter swept past in a flash of steel and shadow guns blazing as tracers streaked across the sky. She banked into the fire, the rounds slicing so close she could hear the metallic ping against her fuselage. Her teeth clenched as she dived, spinning through the canyon where cliffs blurred inches from her wings. She felt the ground rush up and pulled hard, barely scraping over jagged rock, the rush of wind and stone like a whisper of death against her hull. She had no time to breathe before the second fighter locked on. She dragged the jet into a climb, engines screaming, her body slammed by gravity as the fighter chased tight behind. Alarms wailed again, a missile launch, the tone steady and fatal. She twisted, rolling the jet upside down, flipping through the canyon in a move no sane pilot would attempt. The missile sped past, colliding with the rocks in a shower of fire and smoke. The shock lit the cockpit bright, but she pushed through, her mind razor sharp, her breath like fire in her chest. She leveled out, gasping, but alive. Her radar screamed again, another contact, higher, faster. The enemy circling above her, waiting for the right moment. She felt sweat drip into her eyes, but she did not blink her focus, unbreakable. She spoke into the radio, short-clipped words, requesting position and support. The captain's reply was steady, but grim hold 3 more minutes. She wanted to laugh at the impossibility of it, but her mouth was too dry and her hands too busy, holding the jet together with raw will. She pulled into another, roll-cutting between peaks so sharp her wingtips seemed to scrape the stars. The fighter behind her tried to follow, but clipped too close, smashing into the ridge in a ball of flame that shook the valley. She watched the fireball in her mirrors, but felt no relief because 2 more blips still closed in fast. The canyon opened wider ahead, but that only meant less cover and more open sky for them to strike. She knew her only hope was to climb into the storm with them and face death head. On she pulled hard on the stick, the engines roaring as the jet clawed into the night sky. The weight slammed her back vision, darkening at the edges, her breath ragged through the mask. The fighters closed fast, their trails of fire cutting across. The stars. She steadied her aim, flipped switches, armed her payload. Her thumb hovered over the trigger as one fighter screamed into her sights a perfect line, a perfect kill. But to fire meant revealing her position to the other. She hesitated for a breath long enough to feel the universe pause around her. Then she pressed the trigger, the jet shuddering as missiles streaked away into the darkness. The explosion lit the sky bright white, one fighter obliterated in a storm of fire. Her body jolted as the blast wave struck, but she held steady, pulling back into the climb. The last fighter screamed above her, firing down a rain of tracer fire. The cockpit lit red warnings, screaming, the hull rattling with hits. She gritted her teeth, banking hard, every muscle burning from strain. Her mind whispered she could not outlast him. Not this time. But in the corner of her vision, she saw it, the pass opening ahead, the route to the target, narrow, dangerous, almost suicidal to attempt under fire. She knew, if she broke for it, she might escape the hunter above, but one mistake would end everything. She forced the jet lower into the jaws of the pass, the cliffs rising like walls on both sides, the last fighter diving close behind. She whispered a prayer into the silence of her helmet as alarms screamed and stone blurred past, knowing the next breath could be her last. The canyon swallowed her jet hole, shadows clawing across her canopy as she pushed the throttle past its limit, the engines howling in protest. Her body strained against the crushing pull of gravity as stone walls whipped past so close she could almost reach out and touch them. She kept her breath shallow, her hands tight on the stick, every nerve screaming for control because one mistake here would mean fire and silence forever. The enemy fighter dove after her relentless, its guns, spitting streaks of light that shattered rock and sent shards flying through the darkness. She pulled hard, banking into a knife-edge turn. The jet rolling so close to the wall, sparks lit as the wingtip scraped stone. The alarms shrieked in her ears, but she ignored them, forcing the machine to bend to her will. Behind her, the fighter tried to match the move, but clipped wide its wing, striking the cliff sparks erupting as it corrected, fast, still chasing, still hunting. She cursed under her breath, steadying her path deeper into the canyon, the pass narrowing until the sky itself seemed to vanish. The radio cracked again. The SEAL, captain's voice cutting sharp through the chaos. He told her the ground team was pinned, enemy fire chewing them apart, their survival hinging on her strike. She could hear the urgency under his controlled tone, the sound of men fighting for their lives bleeding into the static. Her jaw tightened. She pushed the jet lower, skimming along the riverbed where water sprayed up against her fuselage as tracer fire arced down from ridgelines above. The canyon was alive with enemies hidden in shadow, waiting to tear her apart. She armed her payload, the switches flipping under her gloved fingers, each one echoing like a final decision, her eyes locked on the navigation screen, the target ahead, glowing red, a nest of defenses layered with anti-air, weapons that could slice her jet from the sky. She felt her pulse thunder in her throat, but she kept her grip steady because she had been here before, dancing on the line between life and death, and she had always chosen forward. The canyon narrowed, again, and she whispered a promise to herself that if this was the end, it would not be in retreat. The fighter behind her closed again, its radar lock shrieking in her headset. She threw the jet into a dive, twisting between jagged spires of rock to die. G-force slamming her chest until her ribs ached. She fired flares, the night exploding behind her in showers of fire. But the enemy pilot was skilled, relentless, never letting go. Her teeth ground against the pressure as she banked through another. Cut the world flashing red from alarms and tracer fire. She could almost feel the enemy breathing down her neck, the shadow of his canopy haunting her mirrors. Suddenly, the canyon opened into a wider basin, cliffs parting to reveal a valley lit with fire below. Enemy encampments burned with spotlights cutting the sky, anti-air batteries scanning back and forth, searching for her. She saw the target clear, now a bunker buried into the stone, its defenses alive with radar sweeps. She knew she had seconds to release her payload before the enemy fire locked onto her hull. She dove low engines, screaming her hands, moving faster than thought systems, arming her weapons, every muscle burning with urgency. The enemy fighter climbed high above her, circling like a hawk, waiting for her to strike the target and expose herself. She felt the sweat dripping down her spine, knew her window was razor thin. She breathed once deep, steadying the storm inside her, and then she released. The missiles streaked forward, cutting through the black air like falling stars. She pulled back sharp, banking hard as the ground erupted in light and flame, the bunker vanishing in a thunderous blast that shook the canyon to its roots. The shockwave rattled her bones, but the strike was true. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to believe she had done it, that the ground team now had a chance to live. But then the radar screamed again, louder, sharper. The enemy fighter had locked on from above, diving with a missile. Already away. Her breath caught, her body snapped into instinct. She rolled the jet inverted, plunging back toward the canyon walls, so close the stone blurred inches from her canopy. The missile streaked past, clipping her tail with a burst of fire that sent alarms wailing and metal groaning. Her jet bucked hard, smoke trailing behind, but still she held on. The captain's voice broke through the radio, shouting for her to confirm the strike, shouting that the team was moving, but under heavy fire. She forced her voice steady, saying, "Target destroyed, but under pursuit. Damage critical." Her hands trembled against the stick, but she kept flying lower through the twisting canyon, her jet coughing smoke behind her. The enemy F. The SEAL captain had asked the question with a voice that carried the weight of command, and the room had fallen into a silence thick enough to choke. Every pair of eyes glanced around, searching for someone, anyone to answer, but no one moved, and the silence stretched longer until she quietly rose from her seat. Her motion was so small, yet it carried the gravity of a thunderclap, because in that moment the expectations of everyone shifted, and she knew there would be no turning back once. She admitted what she was. Her frame did not match what they imagined of a combat pilot. She was not towering, nor broad, nor loud, but her presence filled the space with an unspoken defiance. She stood with her shoulders squared, eyes forward, lips pressed, into a thin line as if to hold back the storm inside. The SEAL captain fixed his gaze on her sharp and assessing a look forged from years of choosing who lived and who died, and she felt his scrutiny like fire against her skin. Still, she did not flinch, because she had carried heavier burdens in silence. The captain asked for her name, and she gave it quietly, steady with no tremor. Her words cut through the silence, and a few men shifted in their chairs as if the air had grown heavier. He asked if she had flown combat missions, and she nodded, once her memory flashing back to skies filled with smoke tracer fire carving red paths around her canopy and the sound of alarms screaming in her ears. She saw flashes of faces, comrades' lost call signs, silenced in bursts of static. She said yes with no embellishment, because the truth was already enough to weigh the room. The captain leaned back as if measuring her worth against something unseen. He asked why she stood when others did not, and her answer was simple. She said she was not built to remain seated when lives were on the line. Her words carried no arrogance, only the cold, clear edge of someone who had already gambled her life against impossible odds, and won. He stared at her longer, and she stared back unblinking until the room felt like a battlefield itself, with only two opponents locked in silent challenge. Finally, the captain motioned toward the map spread across the table lines, drawn arrows marked with urgency and symbols of firepower and loss. He explained the mission in clipped tones, the kind of task that could break men who had already seen too much. The target was buried deep enemy defenses, tight, casualties inevitable, unless a pilot could thread the needle in. Conditions that would cripple even the best. He spoke of narrow passes, radar nets, anti-air batteries, and a window so slim it could disappear with a gust of wind. She listened without moving, every word sinking into her bones. When he finished, he asked her if she understood the cost of volunteering, and she thought of all the nights she had flown when her own life balanced on the edge of steel and flame. She thought of the faces she could not save and the voices lost to silence. She thought of promises made to never walk away when called upon, and she realized this was not just a mission. This was the line that divided those who stepped forward from those who stepped back. She said she understood, and her voice carried no hesitation. The SEAL captain nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than her words. He told her to be ready, because the mission was moving fast, too fast for second thoughts or regrets. She stood straighter, her pulse quick but steady, because she knew the time for fear was gone. The others in the room watched her not with doubt now, but with something sharper. Curiosity, respect, maybe even hope. Though none spoke aloud, the silence told her they were waiting to see if she could truly carry the weight of the choice she had made. She returned to her seat, yet she did not feel like the same person who had risen moments ago. The room was different now. Eyes shifting, glances, breaking whispers hushed, as though they had glimpsed a spark of something rare. The captain returned to his notes and orders, but she could feel his gaze flicking toward her again and again, as if he too wondered whether her quiet defiance could hold when the valley of fire opened before them. The mission loomed, heavy over all of them, and she knew the silence of the room was only the calm before the storm. The night was heavy with the weight of expectation, and when she stepped onto the airstrip, the cold wind whipped across her face, carrying the scent of jet fuel and iron. She looked down the line of aircraft, their silhouettes sharp against the faint glow of distant lights, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before every mission. Her boots echoed on the tarmac each step, drawing her closer to the machine that would carry her into the fire. The SEAL captain watched from a distance, arms folded, his eyes never leaving her, as though waiting to see if she would hesitate, but her stride never faltered. The plane loomed. Before her, sleek and unforgiving, a beast that had saved her life and nearly taken it more times than she could count. She reached out, running her hand along the cool metal of its skin, and for a moment she was back in another sky. Years ago. Alarms. Screaming voices cutting in and out of the comm static, her hands gripping the stick while tracer fire sliced the air. She had survived then, and she whispered to herself, she would survive now, because failure was not an option, not when lives hung. On her wings ground, crew moved with silent precision around her, checking lines and loading payloads, their faces tight with focus. She strapped on her gear, each buckle clicking into place like pieces of armor, sealing her into the role she had chosen. She pulled her helmet under her arm and glanced once more toward the captain. He gave the faintest nod, a signal that the weight of the mission now rested fully on her shoulders. She inhaled deep-tasting metal and fuel and forced her heartbeat steady inside. The cockpit, she settled into the seat, every motion practiced and precise. Her hands danced across switches, her eyes scanning the panels with the sharpness of ritual. Each light blinked back at her steady green, as if giving permission to enter the storm. Her helmet clicked into place, sealing her world into one of glass and steel. She breathed into the mask, the sound steady, but inside her chest, the storm raged. She looked toward the runway stretching long and black ahead of her, and she whispered, a promise to herself and to those waiting on her return. The radio crackled with the captain's voice, his tone calm but edged with the urgency of men who knew death waited close. He gave her the coordinates, the timing, the reminder that precision was survival. She acknowledged with a single word and throttled forward, the engines roaring to life like thunder rolling across the valley. The aircraft trembled, eager to leap free of the earth. She pushed harder, the roar rising until the ground fell away beneath her, and the night sky swallowed her whole. The darkness above was vast, yet it offered no comfort. Every shadow could hide a threat, every blip on the radar a weapon ready to strike. She flew low, hugging the terrain, the mountains, rising around her like jagged teeth waiting to snap. Her eyes scanned constantly, her hands firm, yet light on the controls. The radio hissed again with the captain's voice telling her enemy patrols were moving fast, closing on the valley route. She adjusted course, heart hammering, knowing the narrow pass ahead would decide everything. The first burst of fire came, sudden streaks of light cutting the darkness. She banked hard, the aircraft groaning under the force as rounds whipped past too close. The alarms blared, and the cockpit filled with red glow. She gritted her teeth, forcing calm into her veins, pulling the plane through the canyon walls so tight she could almost feel the stones scrape against her wings. She fired flares the night, exploding bright behind her, but the missiles kept chasing their glow, her instincts screaming for faster, sharper movement. She dove low into the black water of the valley river, skimming so close the reflection of her jet rippled below the missiles, struck the cliffs behind, sending shards of rock cascading down into the darkness. Her breath caught sharp, but she pressed forward, refusing to let the fear sink claws into her. She thought of the men waiting for her, the captain counting on her, the silence of the room where she had first stood, and she told herself again, failure was not an option. The radar lit again, multiple contacts closing fast. She adjusted course through the tightest path, her body pressed hard into the seat as gravity clawed at her bones. Her hands moved on instinct, pulling levers, firing bursts of countermeasures, but the sky filled with more threats with every second. Her eyes burned with focus, sweat sliding down her neck as she whispered to herself to hold, steady, to cut through, to reach the mark. Because ahead, beyond the walls of rock and fire, lay the target, and if she reached it, lives could be saved. But then another alarm screamed louder, sharper. A tone she recognized instantly. Enemy fighters closing. From above, her angle trapped her speed locked, and for a moment the night seemed to crush her under its weight. She pulled hard, banking sharp through the canyon walls, sparks flying as her wings scraped stone. But the radar blips did not vanish. They tightened their circle, and she knew she was now hunted not only by machines, but by men trained to kill. She breathed once deep and whispered to herself that she had faced death before, and tonight would be no different as the dark sky opened wider. Into the ambush ahead.